Colin's family know that police have lied in this case, but now they have to witness this firsthand. To begin with, it's important to have a basic understanding of what a fatal accident inquiry is. We see that the FAI is headed by a sheriff, whose role is that of a judge, and the role is to assess the circumstances of death without apportioning blame. To evaluate the circumstances of death, a fundamental principle is that the evidence selected is by the lead investigator, and is based upon the evidence collected in an independent investigation. This is a principle we could easily support. But in our case, this is where it all goes wrong. The lead investigator in this case is the fiscal, and the investigation is that carried out by Fife Police. These are the very people we know that have been presenting a corrupt and manipulated view of events. As we approached the FAI, our concerns were significant. We felt that it was important to convey this to the Crown Office, and so wrote an email outlining concerns before it started. Among the concerns raised was the fact that it was inappropriate for there to be an FAI against the backdrop of such a flawed investigation. Also, like we had numerous times, we highlighted the obvious lacking of independence in this investigation. After all, this is their legal obligation. The FAI began on the 15th of February 2011. The crime was represented by a QC and supported by the fiscal and others. Candice was represented by an advocate and supported by a solicitor and staff. Colin's mother was represented by her solicitor, and Colin's father represented himself. The setup of questioning at the FAI did not lend itself to honest, fair assessment of facts. The last word was always through Candice's advocate, and therefore you can have untruths left as statement of fact, periods covered outside the 48-hour window, and sure as hell the Crown wouldn't contradict. In all, over 30 witnesses were to be called. The experts were focused on pathology and fingerprints. The majority of other witnesses were there to talk about events on the night of Colin's death. Only the senior investigating officer was there to answer questions regarding this investigation. Before we assess some of the evidential findings, we should consider the words of the sheriff from his judgment in this case. In his view, the evidence was reflective of the investigation run by the Crown. This is the very investigation we have been screaming about corruption for well over a year. In this brief review of the evidence presented, we will look at some of the key points of discussion. As stated previously, the view we develop is for two purposes: the defence of Colin and to highlight some of the deliberate misrepresentation of fact. If we first deal with Candice, there was not one of the people who talked of her volatility or possible violence called as a witness. There was a witness who could talk to this and was asked for by Colin's mother's lawyer, but this was refused. Candice's position was also supported by the senior investigating officer, who would have known of all these statements, but he had said he had found nothing untoward about her. So the sheriff only really heard from her family and friends. Colin's mother and his work supervisor gave evidence about how they viewed Colin's state of mind. Although he was upset about his breakup, he was in fact only quiet, but working as normal. The statements that could suggest otherwise were not very strong, so it is unsurprising when at the end the sheriff did not see any suicidal behaviour. This may all sound positive, but why on earth, when reviewing the lead up to Colin's death, was the last person to see Colin alive not a witness? This individual could refute any suggestion that Colin was so down he had not eaten, as they had lunch that day, talk directly to his positive demeanour as he headed home, highlight that Colin did not expect Candice to come back at that point, and he had no wound to his forehead. Why are these essentially positive and informative comments about Colin hidden? We see a very descriptive representation of possible blood specks, as if flicked onto the ceiling. This gives us two aspects of the blood on the ceiling we need to consider. The first was, how long did it take to highlight this, which seems to be a concern for the sheriff. We see that this witness was not interviewed until January 2010, 2.5 years after Colin's death, and 15 months after this investigation began. But is that when the police first knew of this information of the blood splatter, or of this witness having this information? As can be seen in this email sent to Fife Police in November 2008, they were made aware of both the blood and the witness. They also had at least one other statement talking of blood on the ceiling from December 2008. So when is a blood spatter specialist asked for? The first we see of the specialist being asked about blood on the ceiling is in January 2011, just in time for the FBI. This was supposed to be a homicide investigation, and we find key areas of investigation being ignored for over 2 years. And this leads us on to the second concern we have with blood spatter. The interpretation of the possible blood on the ceiling is being regarded too narrowly. It is clear that the blood on the ceiling is not indicative of who stabbed Colin. It is indicative of the knife requiring force to remove it, and what seems to be disregarded is that the removal of the knife and blood on the ceiling is totally incompatible with how they represent Colin doing this. Therefore, the testing for blood is still even today an essential requirement, and we must be asking why is it not been done? Retired Professor of Pathology Mike Green describes how this wound could be self-inflicted.
So as you can see, it's almost a backhanded blow, which would not be as easy, even if you put a bit of force behind it.
What Professor Green shows was that for Colin to have removed the knife, the movement would have been horizontal and incompatible with blood on the ceiling. If we now move on to phone calls, an area that the sheriff gets it completely wrong is that on who phoned emergency services first. This was an understandable error, as the FBI was presented with a false analysis. The analysis treated the time from Candace's phone to that of the emergency services system as being identical. We will see that this does not work. If Candace's times are the same as emergency services, we should see the same end time, but they are not. There is over 1 minute between them. Therefore, it cannot be said that Candace was on her phone to emergency services when she knocked on the neighbour's door. According to the emergency services, the neighbour got through 7 seconds before Candace. It must also be considered that the neighbour had to listen to what was going on, walk into the house and then make the call, and was still through before Candace. What is interesting, Candace has never stated she called emergency services first. Not only do we see the lack of analysis on the phone call timings, we actually have the SIO stating that the 4 witnesses that saw Candace on her phone were all wrong. Colin's family's concerns over the SIO at the FBI were agreed with by the Police Independent Review Commission some years later. Pathology is a very important factor in the final summation of the FBI, and was really contentious throughout our time with the Fiscal's office. Interestingly, when the experts are actually in front of the sheriff, a broad consensus is agreed that the wound would require a significant degree of force. This is a view that was shared by the Crown's QC. It is noted by the sheriff that there was a question raised about the description of location. From the FBI transcripts, this seemed to emanate from one individual and was deemed immaterial. These 2 findings by the sheriff and the QC will become significant when we consider future actions by police. We can see that the source of questioning the precise location appears to be the pathologist that did not attend the scene of Colin's death. This expert, whom we had stated from the outset should not be near this case, would also appear to be the individual behind steering the Deputy Fiscal to challenge every pathologist's view. The paramedic that first attended to Colin, when asked, stated that they thought it was a very unusual wound for someone to inflict upon themselves. Although not deemed an expert, paramedics probably see more knife wounds than any pathologist, as they also deal with survivors. When Professor Busuttil was questioned, he enlightened that he had reduced his original view partly based upon the psychological autopsy. The Crown knew that this autopsy was not legally valid, as per their own letter of May 2010, and yet did not do anything to inform the Professor that this should be removed from his assessment. This behaviour is in keeping with that witnessed through the fiscal meetings in 2009. Maybe they would not correct because of fear of him raising his view on homicide, but they would however push harder to reduce his view when they challenge him on the expectation of prints. Again, the head wound is discussed, and again they speculate, but no real effort is ever given to find the cause of the wound. That is not explained by Candace's narrative. The fingerprint on the knife handle you would think would be significant. The issue at the centre of this is that again the Crown and Police wanting to ignore the conflict in the evidence available. They've been stating it repeatedly that this print was Colin's long before they had even carried out eliminations, falsely informing the psychologist, and in turn someone was lying to Colin's dad. This print was of so little substance it would be inadmissible in a criminal court, and yet they used it with vigour. The lack of print is a real issue here. That has been refused to be assessed. At the FBI, it was a dramatic moment when the fingerprint expert working with Fife Police demonstrated how he thought Colin could have done this. This is despite not knowing which finger the print was from. The key information to refute this, and at the same time really ask big questions, came from the Loathing and Borders expert. No matter how many times the Crown asked him to imagine the knife being held as a dagger, he came back to the same fundamental issue, that there should be clear signs of the other fingers. This perspective that we should be looking for more prints is in keeping with the evidence of Professor Busuttil. He had previously stated that with the grip required to hold the knife and with the stress involved, whoever did this should have left finger and palm prints. These were not present. Despite the obvious logic of Professor Busuttil's opinion, he ended up being attacked at the FAI. The basis of this attack was the fact that there were no signs the knife handle had been wiped. This latter point is true. For this to have any significance, we need to understand what it means to have signs of the knife being wiped. At its most basic, it would suggest the knife had been tampered with after Colin's print was left. But it also signifies that it had been poorly wiped to leave traces in the first place. A thoroughly wiped knife would not leave a trace. So having signs of a wipe surely helps, but having none is of little value, unless, again, there is some inconsistency. The best way to leave this is with the Crown's witness from Loathing and Borders, SPSA, who had already stated that there was no sign of pressure on the print, and resisted numerous times to just agree to the dagger grip philosophy. He's clearly stating that this knife had been thoroughly cleaned before this print had been left. So, if the knife had been cleaned and placed in Colin's hand, where would you hold it? Would there be signs? Well, there is, but this is where they destroyed the DNA. Discussing drugs abuse can be quickly dealt with. Just by reviewing the reply to questions asked by the sheriff to the expert tells us everything. It is clear there was no evidence of regular drug abuse. But the real issue here is why and how the Crown wanted to push this topic. When Colin's father was about to ask questions about drug taking from the situation reports, we see that the sheriff states that he didn't have the documents. Isn't it strange that the very documents the SIO stated were aids for the experts to form opinions are not available to the sheriff? When being questioned on the accuracy of Colin's drug taking, it's ironic that the senior investigating officer, who fails to represent factual statement regarding Candace's demeanour, now openly and completely misrepresents the findings on drugs and uses falsely an example he says he had. That witness was in court that day.
For me, Colin and Candace were always just a lot more social drug takers. Detective, I remember him saying there that he used to hang around with a butcher who had to leave their company because they were doing too much. And that infuriated me because, as I said to them and to everyone else, like, it wasn't them that was doing too much, it was me. I was doing too much, and I felt like you kind of manipulated what I've said into what you wanted it to be for your own gains. So yeah, it frustrated me.
So what was the outcome of the SIO misleading the FAI? The Crown, who has a duty to present full unbiased facts at an FAI, failed to highlight to the sheriff that with their knowledge, this was a clear misrepresentation of fact. Should there have been any evidence or intelligence came in that suggested there was a third party, we would have to look at that. The words of the SIO at the FAI. Let's now look at that. We know that there should be no relatives present at the scene before 8:29 p.m. Candace called two aunts, one at 8:23 and one at 8:24 p.m. The one called at 8:24 p.m, according to the SIO at the FAI, should have got there in about 5 minutes, and thus should have been the first family member present. It was put to the SIO at the FAI, regarding the aunt that lived closest to Colin, that this aunt had said in her statement, when she arrived at the scene, that one of Candace's uncles was present. The SIO responded yes, that this uncle should not have been there at this time. The senior investigating officer said that this uncle and aunt had refused to give statements to them and the Crown on many occasions. The police already had statements that suggest that the uncle was present at a time earlier than he should be. But this was taken much further by Candace stating in her interview that he was there before use when answering the senior investigating officer. This would now place him there even before his home was called. In the schematic, we see that Candace's uncle should arrive no earlier than 8:33 p.m. This is taken from the time of the call at 8:23 p.m, but he is seen at 8:29 by his sister-in-law. And according to Candace, he's there before 8:20 p.m. So we have two clear testimonies, placing this uncle there before it should have been feasible. With regards to third party, the police were also armed with neighbours talking of visitors, and Candace's family in the street, very early in the evening, and even had a witness say that Candace had informed him that an uncle had been there that night. So what did police ever say about this uncle or aunt? To contrast this, we need to be aware that when a friend of Colin's was being traced, they highlighted in their situation reports that he was avoiding them. This uncle and aunt are not mentioned in any situation report, and throughout, Colin's family were led to believe that they were all fully cooperating. This is when it gets even more sinister. Fife Police had created a very detailed timeline of the comings and goings that evening, and the uncle who is first on the scene, who refused to speak to the police, is not on it. But that is not all. The sister-in-law that saw him is also missing. They've made them invisible to the FBI. As the FBI closes, we have to wait, lives on hold, for the weeks until the findings are published.